Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be doing an update on some of the Sharks' more notable prospects that they have in their system. You'll notice that there are a couple of names that are missing from this list. I couldn't include them all. Players like Maxim Letunov, who's playing in the AHL right now, Mario Ferraro, who is not signed yet by the Sharks, but the Sharks have his rights, and he's playing for some sort of college or university or whatever. Players like Jake McGrew, who's playing in the WHL right now, but I tried to outline some of the more talked about Sharks players, and I took two from each junior league, QMJHL, WHL, and OHL, as well as two from the AHL. So to start off, it is Ivan Chekovich, who is having himself a fantastic year thus far with 37 points in 22 games in the QMJHL, and he leads that league in points. He's age 19, so definitely getting a bit up there in age, but still very good for him. The Q is known for having a bit more of an inflated goal total, so there's a lot more offense floating around in the Q compared to the other two junior leagues, but still very nice to see him leading the team or the league entirely in points. And Chekovich really jumped off the map. He was never one who was necessarily considered to be a big thing for the Sharks. He's also a bit of a smaller forward, but he joined the Barracuda after his previous junior year, which was pretty good, and he put up 9 points in the 6 games of those final 6 games for the Barracuda, which they all won, which somehow this miraculous run that the Barracuda ended up making the Calder Cup playoffs, and Chekovich was a huge part of that. And I'm sure a lot of Sharks fans will recall his the first preseason game of this season. Chekovich played and had a fantastic showing. He was immediately sent back to juniors after that. I'm not sure if Wilson thought he wasn't very close to making the team or anything like that, or if he just wanted to get him back to juniors as fast as possible, as the junior season starts in late September, so probably didn't want Chekovich to miss a game. But Chekovich has been proving this calendar year, I guess you could say, that he is a real deal, and we'll see if next year, if he gets into the AHL, I'm not sure what the rules are with the AHL and the CHL, if he's going to be back in the Q next year, or if he can come to the AHL, but if he is in the AHL, maybe he even has a chance of making the actual Sharks roster. Next is Vladislav Kotkov, another Q player. He's 18 years old, so tied for the youngest on this list. 19 games played, 20 points, so he does have that point per game pace. Again, QMJHL, a bit of inflated point totals, but still pretty good for Kotkov. Not necessarily the most hyped up Sharks prospect, but still a solid season for him thus far, and he's still quite young. Next is Joachim Blichfeld in the WHL. In 19 games, he's put up 39 points for the Portland Winterhawks. That is more than 2 points a game. And of course, he is age 20, and so this is his final season in juniors. He's an overager, which means he'll normally be able to dominate the ice when he's on, as he's just more physically mature than most of the other players. He also plays with players like Cody Glass, a very hyped up Golden Knights prospect on his team. And so Joachim Blichfeld isn't necessarily one of the more hyped up Sharks prospects, but with how he's performing thus far this season, it's looking pretty good. Hopefully he's going to be able to not obviously put up numbers like this in the AHL, but put up good numbers in the AHL. And like Chekovich, maybe we can see him make the Sharks roster at some point next season. Next is Noah Gregor, as he's also 20 years old, 13 games played, 17 points in the WHL. You maybe expect a bit more from him as being an overager in the WHL, but still over a point per game pace, and he hasn't played all the games for his team thus far this season. So Gregor looking pretty good. Will join the AHL next season and probably be more of a third or fourth line kind of center for them, maybe second. Next, moving on to the OHL, and the two prospects that some might consider to be the two best, or at least coming into the season, some might be considering them to be the two best prospects, especially since Norris and Balcers were traded to the Ottawa Senators in the Erik Karlsson trade. But first is Sasha Chmelevski. 20 games played, 17 points. He was over a point per game last season, and now that he's 19 years old, I was expecting him to be able to continue that at least. He's not there yet, although only 3 points behind, so it's somewhat disappointing. But we'll see if he's able to get there. He's on the best OHL team, I believe, or very close to the best OHL team. So hopefully his performance can pick it up, as he's one of the more hyped up Sharks prospects who was drafted in a very late round, like Blichfeld, who I didn't mention was a 7th rounder in I think 2016, and Chekovich, who was a 7th rounder in 2017. Chmelevski, the 6th rounder in 2017. Next is Ryan Merkley at 18 years young, 17 games played, 25 points for Merkley, the first round pick from this past year for the Sharks. Of course, everyone knows sort of the storyline behind Merkley, where he's a fantastically skilled defenseman Some even went as far as calling him the second most skilled defenseman in last year's draft, right behind Dahlin. It's just his attitude issues and his defensive play wasn't as good as some of the guys drafted in front of him, like Bouchard and Dobson and Hughes. But Merkley has the skill set, and for Guelph right now he's finding a way to put it together. And some other good signs, besides the fact that I think this is the lead in defenseman points in the OHL, is that he's improved his plus minus by a lot. It has not been good in his first 2 seasons in the OHL, but this season it is getting better, even though it is still a slight negative. And what is also very nice to see is that his penalty minutes are severely down. I believe he had 63 penalty minutes in 63 games last season. He's down to only 10 so far through these first 17 games. So if we project a similar pace, that should be at around 30 to 35 to 40-ish penalty minutes. Still maybe a bit high, but is definitely a lot better for a player who's trying to get his discipline under control. And Merkley definitely the most hyped up prospect in the Sharks system at this point, and probably since Timo Meier in 2015 was drafted. Next, moving on to the AHL, I have Jaden Halbegowitz, I believe is maybe somehow how you pronounce it. He's a player who was signed by the Sharks last season. He had a fantastic overage season in the WHL. I think he put up something like 70 goals, so a massive amount, certainly. And he's been doing a pretty solid performance so far in the AHL, tied for the team lead in points with Francis Perron, player picked up in the Carlson trade from the Senators. He has 11 points, and he's a bit of a smaller forward, so it's tough to break into the NHL as a smaller forward. You see some of those guys, and normally when you're a smaller forward and you make it to the NHL, you end up being one of the best, because that's sort of what is required. You have to have all of that skill. Most of the bottom 6 guys are bigger guys who are able to hold their own against sort of other checking lines. We'll see what happens to Jaden. Hopefully he can progress into the NHL and maybe be a middle 6, top 6 winger for this team. It's hard to say, just because he is a smaller guy, so maybe he'll be sort of stunted at the AHL level, but there is a lot of hope for him. Next is Jeremy Roy, a defenseman who has had a lot of issues in his career thus far. The past 2 seasons, he's had massive injuries. This was a player who was extremely hyped up back, I think, in the 2015 draft. The San Jose Sharks moved up in the second round to draft this guy 31st overall, so the first pick in the second round, because a lot of people thought that Jeremy Roy was going to be a first round pick, and it didn't end up happening. And so people were saying that this was a steal for the San Jose Sharks, and it hasn't panned out as such because of those 2 massive injuries. Currently 13 games played, 8 points, and he's a defenseman, so that is a pretty solid point total. But hopefully the Sharks, for the Sharks' sake, that Roy does live up to the hype, because you look at who was drafted after him. Christian Fischer, a decent forward for the Arizona Coyotes, drafted immediately 32nd overall. A couple picks later, Travis Dermott for the Maple Leafs. He's looking okay in the league so far. But after that, 35th overall was Sebastian Aho of the Carolina Hurricanes. So for the Sharks' sake, that they don't get somewhat embarrassed that they didn't pick some of these other players, hopefully Roy pans out for them. With his development being stunted a bit, it might take a couple more years, at age 23, 24, before he can really break into the NHL, especially with how established the top 6 for the Sharks is at the moment, and with a couple of guys ahead of him on the depth chart. But it's going to be interesting to watch how Roy does in his first healthy season. Finally, a goaltender on this list, Zachary Emma, who was recently drafted just this past year, in the same year that Merkley was drafted. He's playing for the best QMJHL team and one of the best defensive QMJHL team, which is rare to see. But he's played 8 games. He's won all 8 of them with a 1.98 GAA and a .937 save percentage, leads the league in save percentage. He also has 2 shutouts in those 8 games. So it is certainly a small sample size, not as small as, say, like 3, where you don't read into it at all. 8 is still decent. But again, he's on one of the best QMJHL teams, QMJHL team that is very defensive compared to most other Q teams. And so it isn't some sort of massive hype for a player like this, but a goaltender who's doing well in a league that is so offensively gifted like the QMJHL, where defense isn't necessarily the first priority. It's nice to see out of an 18-year-old. And Martin Jones, the starter for the Sharks at the moment, is still relatively young, so it's not like Emma is going to end up being the guy for the Sharks within the next year, 2 years, even 3 years. But down the line, at age 23, 24, if the Sharks can keep his rights with them, maybe he can be a guy for the Sharks who moves from backup or maybe even starter in the future. It's definitely a long shot, I guess you could say, but it was just something I wanted to highlight. Class dismissed.